I made myself an espresso with my Rencilio this morning, so I think I'm trying to get into the Italian spirit. All right, so I'm going to talk about sort of how we've, what I think is a success story in open and reproducible science in the field of neuroimaging, and talk really about how it's taken, was taken a couple of decades and really the development of an entire ecosystem. So, I hope we all agree that openness is a critical element for reproducible science. And I like this old quote from David Donahoe: an article about a computational result is advertising, not scholarship. The actual scholarship is the full software environment code and data that produce the result. And so we've, spent a lot of time and effort trying to sort of make it possible to actually share the actual scholarship, for brain imaging studies. So I'm going to talk about, the efforts of the center that I run at Stanford that have been focused on kind of several aspects of openness. And one is about open data. And I'll focus on open neuro, but, we've really been involved in a number of different platforms, so sharing different types of imaging data. Open tools, I'll say a bit about MRI-QC and fMRI prep, which are open source tools that we've developed. And then sort of underlying this is an open standard, which I think has been really important for making data sharing in particular effective, but also enabling these open tools as well. So interestingly, in neuroimaging, we had this false start about 20 years ago. In right around 2000, this center was developed called the fMRI Data Center by Mike Gazzaniga and Jack Van Horn at Dartmouth. And they basically allowed people to upload data sets, and they pushed a couple of journals to actually start requiring people to upload their data. PNAS and the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience started requiring people for publication to upload their data. And there was a huge outcry from the community about this. There were a couple of editorials, and there was this open letter that was sent around by a number of fairly prominent neuroimaging researchers, basically saying, we're particularly concerned with any journal's decision to require all authors of all papers to submit all experimental data pertaining to their paper to the data center. So the field just wasn't ready for data sharing at that point. But I think, 20 years later, it's pretty clear that data sharing is becoming the norm in neuroimaging. I wouldn't say it's the norm yet, but it's certainly, moving towards becoming the norm. And to the degree that a couple of years ago, a senior researcher who will not be named this was at the Organization for Human Brain Mapping meeting, was overheard saying that OHBM has been taken over by the open science zealots. And interestingly, this person has now become a big advocate of open science. So I think there's been a lot of progress in our community. And we, one of the things that we outlined in this recent review and annual reviews of biomedical data science was, that there's really a set of different resources that share different types of data. And those vary both in the difficulty and cost of sharing, right? Raw data is hard to share. Statistical maps are easier. Coordinates from papers are really easy. But, the harder the data are to share, the more reusable they are. I mean, now there's a bunch of different projects that are sharing different types of data. And, the ones that I think have gotten the most play, or certainly the most attention, are, a number of projects that have really been doing what we call prospective data sharing. They're trying to share data. Basically, these are projects that were built primarily to collect data that will be shared. So the Human Connectome Project and the ABCD study are both projects that were built primarily to generate data so that other people could take them and use them. And, ABCD is still going on. Human Connectome Project has been remarkably successful in, giving people a data set that's been used in hundreds of publications at this point. And it's really, I think, nobody would argue that project has really changed the game in the neuroimaging field. So I'm going to talk about the other type of data sharing, which is retrospective data sharing. Once someone has done a study, how do they go about actually sharing their data? And we've been involved in kind of developing, what I think of as an open ecosystem for this type of data sharing. On the one end, you have NeuroSynth, which is a project that shares the coordinates, the XYZ coordinates of activation that are published in brain imaging papers. And on the other end, you have Open Neuro, which shares basically full raw data sets from imaging studies. And in the middle, you have NeuroVault, which is basically allows people to share statistical maps, which are sort of the results from studies, which are somewhere between the coordinates and the raw data. I'm going to focus primarily today on Open Neuro. But I want to highlight the fact that simply sharing data is not sufficient. It needs to be shared in a way that actually makes it useful for people. And this is captured in this funny cartoon that you can find on YouTube with a sad panda trying to get somebody else to share their data. And the person, this is the quote from the sad panda: "I received the data, but when I opened it up, it was in hexadecimal." The other person: "Yes, that's right. I cannot read hexadecimal. You asked for my data and I gave it to you. I've done what you asked," right? So this is like, the worst kind of data sharing. Is there a guide to the data anywhere? Yes, of course. It's the article that's published in Science. So many, we've seen those types of like poor data sharing happen many times. And so the question is, how do we make data sharing happen and work well? And so we've been involved in developing this thing called the Brain Imaging Data Structure, or BIDS, which has become really a community-based open standard for really a broad range of neuroimaging data now. And it comprises two things. It's a file organization standard and file naming standard, and then also a standard for how metadata, the data about the data set, should be described. So we sort of initiated development of BIDS back in 2015, sort of in step with our development of the Open Neuro project. We realized we needed a kind of a broad standard. And so we had a meeting at Stanford and started putting together this draft standard. Later that year, we posted it with a bunch of example data sets and solicited feedback from the community. And then following year, published a paper. And you can see, we really brought in people from all across the different software groups, really all across primarily the fMRI literature. At this point, the standard has grown substantially. It was started really, by Chris Gorgolewski, who was in my lab at that point and now has moved to Google. And everybody was worried that when he left, it would kind of fall apart. And amazingly, it's kept going. We now have an elected steering group that I'm a part of. We have 4 maintainers who basically keep things going. We've had a bunch of meetings, a ton of contributors on the GitHub page. So it's really become something that a lot of people around the world care about and contribute to. So what is, first, I guess, what are the principles behind BIDS? Why has it been so successful? And I think first, we really focused on adoption. The idea is the most important thing is to build something that people will actually use. And one of the things that we did was to keep it as similar as possible to what people were already doing in their labs. And this means that there are certainly some technological things we might have done that would have made it more powerful. But anything that we thought was going to sort of make it harder for users to actually use and take it farther from what they already do in their lab, we tried to stay away from. We also really focused on engaging the community and making sure that a broad set of people took a look at everything before we instituted anything. Second, we tried to not reinvent the wheel. Whenever there was an existing standard, we used that. So all the file formats are file formats that people in the community were already using. And I think most important, I'll come back to this at the end, is the 80-20 rule, the so-called Pareto principle, which is focusing on the most common use cases and not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? When you hang out with engineers, they really like to find the edge cases and tell you why nothing's going to work because you can't, deal with this one edge case that is never going to actually appear in the real world. So we decided that, there's going to be some things that won't work, but we want to focus on the most common use cases and make sure that they work really well. So when we collect data from an MRI scanner, it looks like what you see here on the left. It comes out usually in a format called DICOM, which is, organized in a way that nobody could look at and understand. It's, just a bunch of seemingly random numbers. On the right, you see what a BIDS data set looks like. It's organized in the way that most people already organized data in their lab. You have data for each individual subject. Those are broken into different types of data: anatomical, functional, diffusion data. You have some various information, for example, information about all the different participants. So that's roughly what a BIDS data set looks like. So there's really two parts of the BIDS standard. One is, well, first let's look at the file types, right? So we use for imaging data, the standard is to use this format called NIfTY, which was, one of the amazing things about imaging is we actually agreed on a format for files, and all the software packages now read this format or a couple of different sort of extensions of it. And so it really does allow us to, to use a single format that everybody can kind of, work with. We store in text files, things like the participant age and, various metadata about the participants. And then for more structured data, we use this relatively standard format called JSON that allows you to store kind of, complex information and is easily, you can work with it from pretty much any programming language. We also have templates for how you name things. So we have a template for directory naming. You can have, multiple sessions within a subject. You can have different data types within each session. And we have a file naming template, and, a ton of discussion went into exactly what should go into this, into the file name versus being, so, if you have metadata, it can either go in the file name or it could go into the what we call a sidecar file that sort of sits alongside. I didn't show it there. There's a JSON file that goes with each image file that basically contains lots of metadata about that file. Now, one of the problems that we realized early on is that, if somebody can't tell whether their data meet the standard, then it's not a very useful standard. And so we decided early on to basically tie the standard to a validator, so that somebody could, sort of point the validator at their data set and it will tell them, is it a valid BIDS data set or not? And if not, what's wrong with it? What do you need to do to make it a valid BIDS data set? And part of the reason for this was that we, for Open Neuro, we wanted to be able to automatically ingest data without having to have human curators work on the data. We had done that in our previous OpenFMRI project, and it's just not a sustainable model. We can't pay people to help get data sets into the right format. So in some sense, the idea is to kind of push the curation back on the user and then have this validator basically check it and tell people if there's any problems. So we have this thing that runs in the browser. So it can actually, before anybody ever uploads any data, it can look at their data and tell them, is it a valid BIDS data set, or in this case, it's not. This can also be run from the command line. There's also now, so getting to this ecosystem idea, there's a bunch of tooling that's grown up around BIDS. And one of the really important tools is a package called PyBids that Tal Yarkoni, who's now at Twitter, was involved in developing. So this basically provides you with the ability to, you load in a BIDS project, and then you can, for example, say, who are all the subjects, find all the data types for a particular subject, get me the metadata or some feature of the metadata from a particular scan. So it provides really powerful tools for both querying and working with BIDS data. And that's become the basis for a lot of things that people now do with BIDS data. So one of the important aspects of BIDS is that it's extendable. Through a process kind of inspired by the way that extensions work in open source software development. So, the original standard was focused on several particular types of raw MRI data, but there are now extensions to different modalities, MEG, EEG, intracranial EEG, quantitative MRI, and arterial spin labeling MRI. Actually, PET should go up into here now because the PET extension has also now been just approved recently. And there's a bunch of other, extensions that are ongoing. Those are all focused on raw data. We've also been involved in data type extensions, particularly around what we call derivative data. So data that had been processed. And obviously that's in many ways, a much harder challenge because things, there's many different things, the world of things that come off of a scanner is much smaller than the world of things that are generated by software that processes those data. We've also been involved. One thing that we're really excited about is actually developing an extension that provides people a way to describe a statistical model for a brain imaging data set basically in a text file in kind of a software independent way. The idea being you can write down what your model should look like, and any software package that can read that in would be able to basically go run that model. And that's going to provide a much more kind of transparent way to specify statistical models. BIDS has been adopted really heavily. It was endorsed by the INCF, which is kind of like the global informatics working group, as a community standard. It's actually the first one they endorsed. It's been adopted by a bunch of different projects, and there's now data from probably well over 30, probably over 50,000 people at this point, 50,000 participants that are available in BIDS format. Now, another one of the things that we wanted to do to incentivize the use of BIDS was to provide people tools such that if their data were in BIDS, it'd be really easy to apply those tools to the data. And so Chris and I developed this idea of a BIDS app, which is basically a containerized software application. I'm not going to kind of go into the idea behind containers, but really the idea is it's something that can hold all of the software and dependencies that you need to run some particular package. And it allows really good reproducibility because the container can encapsulate all the exact versions of the software and all of the dependencies and libraries. So I'm going to show you examples of a couple of BIDS apps that we've developed. And so the first one is something developed principally by Oscar Esteban, who's now in Lausanne, called MRI-QC. So for a long time, it was really challenging to sort of assess the quality of MRI data. And having data in BIDS made it straightforward to then build a tool that could read in a data set and give back a set of reports, both at the group and the individual level, showing a bunch of different, what we call image quality metrics that allow one. So, you can, for example, look at these plots. You can see this particular subject is kind of an outlier. Click on that, then it takes you to an individual report, and you can sort of look at their data and try to figure out sort of what's going on. So, so this has become a really powerful tool for allowing people to relatively easily do quality control on MRI, both functional and structural MRI data sets. One of the things that we do here is that whenever anybody runs MRI-QC, unless they opt out, the quality metrics are summarized and sent to an open API where anybody can then go and grab them. We wrote a scientific data paper about this, and there's now, actually that number is old. It's, I think it's over 400,000, 500,000 scans at this point. And this is just one example of what you can do. For example, you want to know, is the temporal signal noise ratio related to this particular feature of images called multiband factor, and you can plot that out based on these many data sets that are in this database. So another BIDS app that we've been involved in developing is this thing called fMRI Prep. So you may or may not know that before you can have fMRI data ready for applying statistical models or machine learning or whatever you want to do, there's a bunch of pre-processing that has to happen to get the data ready to analyze, both on the anatomical images and on the functional images. And there's many different ways to do all those things. And generally, historically, the way that it's worked is that each lab basically picks a software package, and they use that software package for all of the different parts of the workflow. And we think that there's certainly differences between packages such that some packages do things better than others at particular steps. And so what we did with fMRI Prep was try to basically take the best at each step and put it together. And this leverages a package called NiPipe, which is a Python-based workflow management system that basically allows you to do this mixing and matching of tools from different software packages. And so this allows us to do, to take in a data set, and we benchmarked it on a large number of fMRI data sets to make sure that it's robust. The idea is it should be able to take any fMRI data set and process it as well as possible. If it includes field maps, we use those, and so on. And it does analysis or pre-processing both on the cortical surface and in the volume. So it allows a lot of different options for how the data get processed. So we try to basically be agnostic towards how the data are going to be analyzed and provide people with sort of the best possible pre-processing. Now, so this is an example of, kind of what one of the outputs from or the I guess you might call the reports from fMRI prep looks like. So we try to give people, some insight into what's happening, under the hood, because otherwise it's just a black box. And so we provide people with reports. I don't know if you can see the animation here, but this is just one of the tools that Oscar developed to allow you to really easily assess whether the alignment of the structural and the functional data was actually successful by animating back and forth with the cortical surface overlaid. So we've tried to provide people tools to allow them to tell them basically, these are the things you should certainly check to make sure that they worked well, that we can't really check in an automated way as well as we'd like. It's become remarkably successful. These are data from the end of 2020, beginning of 2021, showing the number of successful runs per week. So we have a telemetry system. Again, people can opt out, but if they don't, anytime it's run, it sends some information back to our system regarding whether it was successful or not, and if it failed, what was the error. So we know if something suddenly breaks, we will start getting reports about it before people start griping at us, because our telemetry system will see that. We saw well over 100,000 successful runs in 2020, and we're on track to exceed that in 2021. So I've talked about, some of the software packages that we developed. Now I want to talk about one of the particular data sharing repositories that we've been involved in, particularly for sharing raw data, called OpenNeuro. You can find it at openneuro.org. And it's basically a free and open platform for sharing any kind of data for which there is a bid standard. So it started out with MRI, but now you can share any of these types of data that you see here, because they've all been included now in the bid standard. And we have, as you can see, we have over 600 data sets, well over 20,000 participants. So sorry, this is tiny, you probably can't read it, but when a data set gets uploaded, basically, and the person says, yes, I'd like to share this publicly, it ends up in this public data sets listing. And you can see here some of the popular ones. The top one's been downloaded 1,400 times and looked at over 1 million times. And so the data become instantly available. You can actually get this without even logging into the system. You can see it as a guest. And then if you were to sort of zoom into that first data set, you have some information about the data set. This turns out to be one that we had published a few years ago. And you'll notice that the data set has different versions. So basically, in order to share a data set publicly, you have to take what we call a snapshot of the data. And that sort of freezes that version of the data set. So when you share that, everybody knows that this is exactly the data set that you're working with. If something gets changed in the future, you'll have to create a new version, and it'll actually get a different identifier in order to be able to access that. And we have viewers, so you can view the different types of files. And you'll notice it says here bids validation, right? So in order to upload the data, it has to be valid. Now, sometimes, if the validator changes, occasionally things go from being valid to invalid, and we will revalidate, in time, and then sort of work with people to try to fix that. This is what it looks like when you go to upload a data set. Before anything actually gets uploaded, you select the files, and then it runs the validator in the browser and basically tells you, in this case, there were no errors. There were some warnings that you can fix or not. And then, as I mentioned, all the data sets are versioned so that you know exactly what you're getting. And if you want to get the data, there's a download button here you can just click on. Or, for big data sets, downloading them by your browser is probably not the best thing because those downloads can get sort of, interrupted. So we have a number of other tools that are better for really large data sets that can allow you to sort of continue a download if it gets interrupted. In particular, there's this tool called DataLad that you may be familiar with, which is a really powerful tool for accessing lots of shared data, not just OpenNeuro. But if you want to grab a particular data set, all you have to do is say, DataLad install, and it will go grab that data set for you. Every data set receives a persistent identifier, what's called a DOI. And this is, I would say, probably the biggest use case for OpenNeuro right now is, people who want to publish, who are publishing a paper and the journal requires that they provide a DOI for the data set. And so we can make it very easy for them to, if their data are in the BIDS format, it's very easy for them to get a DOI. In these, for example, if you're going to publish something in Nature Scientific Data, they want you to be able to provide a DOI. So that's an example of one of James Booth's papers that did that. So we, anytime you share something, it's really important that it has some terms associated with it, which we often use the term license, even though that's not legally exactly the right word. So we provide the default license for data in OpenNeuro is what's called a CC0, which is a Creative Commons level 0, which is really what we call a public domain dedication. It's basically saying, take these data and do whatever you want with them. We're putting them out into the public domain. You can copy, modify, distribute, and do whatever you want, even for commercial purposes, all without asking permission. And we think that this is important because it makes the data as useful as possible to as many people as possible. Anytime you start, leveling requirements on what can be done with the data, then that's going to limit the number of people who can work with them. Now, and this is something that can work in the US and cannot currently work in Europe because of GDPR. We're working with a group in Denmark who's trying to develop basically kind of a GDPR friendly version of this, which would basically have the metadata stored on OpenNeuro. And then if you want to access the data, you click on it and it takes you to the place where you could work out the data use agreement with whoever owns the data. That obviously is not as open, but that's the legal reality in Europe. And so so we also, we want to at least be able to make those data findable and accessible so that, if somebody wants them, they can then go, deal with whatever requirements there are on the data use agreement. But for data from jurisdictions where it's legally possible, we currently support this CC0 sharing. Now, obviously, in order to share like this, we first need to make sure that subjects actually understand that their data are going to be shared in this way. And so a group has worked together to generate this thing called the Open Brain Consent, which is consent language, recommended consent language for data that are going to be shared. And there actually is a GDPR modification of this that's accessible at that site as well now. So we recommend that anybody who's going to be collecting data uses the recommended consent language so that their subjects will be aware that their data are going to be shared publicly and that there is, some small degree of risk. Now, obviously, the main risk that we worry about is re-identification. The main risk of re-identification from MRI data is the ability to reconstruct, basically the person's face from a structural MRI scan. So we require that any data that are uploaded to OpenNeuro have the face structure removed from structural images. And there's a bunch of tools for that. We currently go through manually and check that that's been done properly. And occasionally we find, a data set that was uploaded that had face structure. We remove it and have the users fix that. We're currently working on a tool that could automatically detect faces. And I should mention, there's currently some ongoing concern. There's some proof of concepts that suggest that even using these sort of defaced images, that one can, with some degree of accuracy, identify the individuals, probably from this, either from their skull shape or from this like remaining kind of features in the brow. And so there's a lot of interest in developing what are called refacing tools that can basically, take all of this and sort of replace it with something that will make it very difficult for any, machine learning algorithm to re-identify. So that's an area that there's also some ongoing work on. This shows the growth of the database over the last, the database started in 2017. The data here started in 2018 because we moved to a new storage engine, so we don't have the numbers from earlier days. But you can see that it's basically grown really sort of systematically over the last 3 years. We just reached 20,000 subjects and 600 data sets in the last couple of months. Now, obviously it's important that the data are actually being reused. We don't want to just share data that are going to just sit there and do nothing. So we have a paper that's currently out as a preprint you can find on bioRxiv that outlines a bunch of the features of the Open Neuro database and project. And one thing we did was we went through manually and found all of the published reuses that we could identify as of June of this year. And this shows a plot of those over the last 3 years, showing that there's been a really substantial increase in the number of journal publications and preprints that have used Open Neuro data. The last bar here is just for the first half of 2021. So that's clearly going to be a big rise from 2020. So we're happy to see that the data are being pretty heavily reused. So what are the keys to success? I think we as a field have been really successful in making data sharing happen, and sort of convincing the community that there's value in data sharing. And I've certainly I talked to people from a lot of other scientific fields or even other subfields of neuroscience, who are struggling to make data sharing happen at all. And so I think that we have learned some lessons, but there's also some important things about neuroimaging that have made it, relatively easy. One is that our data are digital end to end, right? The data come off the scanner in a digital form, and there's never really any manual steps, at least for the raw data. And so that makes it much easier to institute these types of the types of procedures that we use. We already had standardized file formats, with Nifty. And then, in the last 6 years, we've had the development of BIDs. And so this one makes the data immediately usable by anyone, right? So one of the burdens of data sharing is, you share your data and then people start bothering you because they want to know like where some particular data are, in the data set. BIDs makes that much less likely to happen. Like generally when people reach out to us about one of our data sets that we've shared, it's usually because they've either found an error, like something is missing from the data, or like some of the metadata are unclear. It's very rarely like, where do I find the functional scan for run 3 for this subject, because that's just clear from the structure of BIDs. This also reduces the burden of curation and preparation. A lot of labs have just moved to BIDs for their standard for organizing all their data, in part because I think people have come to realize that sharing data with sharing data isn't just about sharing it with other people. It's also about sharing it with yourself in the future, right? If you want to go back to a data set you collected 2 years ago, if it's not in a standardized format, you're going to spend a bunch of time trying to figure out what's even there. And so I think that's been one of the big drivers of people moving to BIDs, is realizing that it's not just about sharing with other people. There's also been, I think, demonstrated scientific utility. A lot of success stories of, researchers who have basically built careers largely working with open shared data, and lots of scientific findings that wouldn't have been possible without openly shared data. Certainly the Human Connectome Project has enabled a number of people to build careers asking interesting questions about, modeling the data that they wouldn't have been able to do if those data didn't exist. So what are some of the lessons that we've learned? I think that, growing out of the fMRI data center, issues, we learned that, really, if you're going to put a mandate for sharing in place, the community needs to be behind it, unless there's really powerful advocates. So for example, in genomics, around the time of the Human Genome Project, there was a lot of, basically, there was a meeting in Bermuda, and a bunch of groups, funders and publishers, basically decided we're going to make everybody share their data. And they're the advocates were powerful enough that they could make that happen. But in general, you need the community to be buying into the sharing. And I think one thing that's really important is that the people who are advocates of sharing are actually members of the research community, like labs like mine and a number of the others that were involved in developing OpenFMRI and now Open Neuro. That, we're really kind of walking the walk. And there's a term they use in Silicon Valley called dog fooding, which is the idea is like, if you're making dog food, you need to like be eating your own dog food. And I think that's, that's been really important for labs like ours to actually show, hey, look, we're not just like telling people they should share, we're actually, doing the work and showing that it's working for us. We've gotten, for example, in that the data set that I mentioned, we have, I think, a couple hundred citations on the data paper for that data set now. So it's actually been useful for us. I think one of the big lessons has been keeping it simple. On the right, I'm showing you a schematic from a project. It was a data sharing project that started in the early 2000s called the BIRN, Biomedical Informatics Research Network. And this is a schematic of their informatics architecture. And I have this, this kind of tagline that if there's more than 2 acronyms that somebody has to learn, then it's likely that people are going to glaze over and just kind of not use it. And for this thing, you had to buy like a whole big rack of computers just to sort of run the thing at your institution. It was way over-engineered, and it basically failed to take off, I think, largely for that reason, because it was just too hard for anybody to actually use. And finally, I think that, our focus on the Pareto principle has really paid off. That, we didn't let the perfect become the enemy of the good. We got stuff done that didn't work for everybody, but it worked for most people most of the time. And there's a process to, if there's something that's really important to the community that isn't working or that can't be done right now, there's an extension process. So if people want to do the work and add it in, they can. And so some of those edge cases have now started to be incorporated into bids. But I think that it's really been an example of the importance of this principle. So I like the cartoon on the right here of the person walking in the bubble, because in many ways we do live in a bubble in the neuroimaging world, and certainly the part of the neuroimaging world that I'm in, that sort of, the people who go to the Organization for Human Brain Mapping meeting, we've built this ecosystem that I think, when other people look at, it's enviable in a lot of ways. That, data sharing has become both, relatively common and relatively easy. And it's really taken, the last 5 years, 6 years of work on infrastructure, particularly on bids, but also on, other projects like Open Neuro, to basically ease the friction, to make it easier for people to be able to do that. And I think community engagement has really been the key. It hasn't just been like, this is a Poldrack lab project. We've really tried to work with the community and make things, be owned by the community, and keeping what we're doing as close as possible to those people in the community to keep them engaged. So I'm going to stop there. Thank my lab, people who funded us, Chris Gorolewski, who was really instrumental in getting a lot of this going, and then Squishy Media is a company that we've worked with to do a lot of the development on these projects. And we have a few minutes for questions.
Thanks a lot, Russ. Thank you. You give us lots of information, but some of us maybe was familiar with that already. Some other was definitely new, at least to me. So yeah, we do have a few minutes for questions. So if anyone wants to ask questions, of course, even among the attendees, just raise your hands or put down your question in writing in the Q&A tool if you're too shy to speak loud. There we go. Roberto Guidotti. I'll allow you to talk. So now you should be able to, yeah, make yourself heard.
Okay, cool. I hope you can hear me.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. So thank you for the talk and for the tools that you are implementing in your lab and across all the community. My question was maybe the final part of your talk. So what to do next? I mean, what are the steps that you think that are needed for a full or reproducibility to fulfill this reproducibility gap?
Yeah. So I think we're worried a lot about data analysis at this point. So we had a paper last year, this project called the NARPS project. Some of you may have been involved in it, where we collected a data set, gave it out to many different groups and had them analyze it, and saw that even given the same data, the analytic results varied a lot between groups. And so we've become, sort of really interested in thinking about how to address that problem. And one of the ways we want to address it is to provide tools to allow people to analyze a data set in many different ways, and then basically sort of meta-analyze across the results to try to find like what are the results that are sort of consistent across different types of analyses. We call this multiverse analysis. So we have a tool we're developing called FitLens, which will work with, I mentioned the statistical models framework we're developing for bids. So the idea would be you have 100 different models you want to run. They're specified in each of those text files for the bid stats models. And then the FitLens tool will take each of them, run them, and then we'll sort of put them together and meta-analyze them. So I think that's one of the really important parts that remains to be dealt with. The other is really sort of figuring out how to organize the results of data analysis and convincing software packages to use. So we've developed at least the beginnings of a bids, we call the bids derivative standard. And we think, and now we need to convince software developers to actually use that in their software. So I can maybe
go ahead.
One more question and then I'll need to go.
Yeah, there's one more question for Luba Papeo, who's now allowed to talk. Go ahead, Luba.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so thanks for your talk, very informative indeed. I wanted to ask whether, do we really need to store all this data, in the sense that aren't you afraid that they will become obsolete in a few years? Perhaps I'm just back from a Neurospin in Paris, where I saw a 11.5 Tesla MRI, and I see more and more paper on 7 Tesla MRI. And most of the data that are stored now are on 3 and 4 Tesla. So I'm worrying that, at some point we may realize that we don't need those data.
I think that's an open question. I think we think it's important in part for, as long as people are publishing papers using 3T, for example, we think it's important for the data, associated with those papers to be shared so that people can try to reproduce the results, or to combine another use case is to take multiple data sets and combine them to do stuff that an individual lab couldn't do on their own. It may be, if it may be the case right now, actually storage is free for us because Amazon gives us free storage because we're part of their public data sets project. It may be that, years down the road, if we start seeing those data sets that haven't been touched in 5 years, we may start dropping those. But as long as like storage is free or cheap, I don't see a cost to holding on to those. So I have to run. Thanks again for the invitation, and feel free to reach out by email if anybody has any other questions.
Thanks a lot, Russ. Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
And actually, it was very timely.